Chapter 14. Saturday, June 22nd, 1776. Life very uncertain, seeming dangers scattered thick around us, plots against the military, and it is whispered against the Senate. Let us prepare for the worst. We can die here but once. May all our business, all our purposes and pursuits tend to fit us for that important event. Letter of Congressional Delegate Abraham Clark to Elias Dayton. The next day I carried a basket of eels from the fish market to Wall Street, thinking only of hot eel pie for supper. I had not eaten eel pie since Mamma died, Miss Mary Finch not being fond of it. But Master Lockton enjoyed the dish, so fat eels weighed down my basket. I fervently hoped Becky would chop off their heads and strip off their skins. It made me go all jumbly in the belly to chop off heads. I entered the kitchen and set the basket on the table. Ruth hummed quietly to herself, shelling peas into a large wooden bowl, and Becky chopped kale. Madam walked in from the front hall, her half hair fallen out of her cap, and stains of sweat under the arms of her dress. She crossed the room, peered out the back door, crossed her arms over her chest, and tapped her foot with impatience, then disappeared into the next room. "I require you, girl," she said. Becky looked at me, eyes wide and warning. "Ma'am?" I asked. Madam came back into the kitchen carrying a silver tray. She shoved it into my arms. "You will serve your master and his companions." Becky slowly shook her head back and forth. "Are you sure, madam? That's what the master requested?" she asked slowly. "'Tis hard to interpret the ways of menfolk, them being so complex and all, but surely when he said, 'Let nothing disturb us,' that was indeed his true meaning." "Be quiet, Becky," Madam snapped. "You have the manners of a donkey and the voice of a goose." Becky said nothing more, but chopped faster. Madam paced back and forth. "The mayor of New York is a supremely important man, could well be the next royal governor. It is hardly appropriate to welcome him into our home without offering refreshment." She turned to me. "You will not put one foot wrong." When the tray was loaded so heavily I could scarce lift it, Madam preceded me down the hall and waited by the closed door to the library. "Go on," she told me, without offering to help. I kicked at the door with my shoe and called out, "Wine, sir, and a bite to eat." "Leave us," responded Lockton. Madam knocked on the door with a not terribly refined fist. "Come now, Elihu, show some graciousness." Deep voices in the room conferred. Then the door was unlocked and opened. Madam stepped toward the opening, but Lockton filled the frame. "Thank you, dear," he said. "The girl can serve us. I'll send her to you if I am in need of anything more." Madam tried to look beyond him to the distinguished guest, but could not see through the thick form of her husband. "Very well," she said loudly. "I shall be composing a letter to our cousins in London, our cousins who are so well regarded by His Majesty." "Excellent suggestion, dear." He stepped out of the way so that I might enter. There were only two men besides Master Lockton, Gold Buttons, wearing a shabby waistcoat of black wool, and the third man who I took to be the mayor. The mayor had on a fine wig, properly powdered and pulled back, with a curl at the end of his queue, a sable coat and matching breeches, a maroon waistcoat, and a white silk cravat tied closely around his neck, atop his shirt. The windows were all closed, but sun streamed in, heating up the room to a slow simmer, and bringing forth the ripe stink of underwashed gentlemen. A broad, brightly colored map of the coastline was spread on the master's desk, weighted at each end by a heavy book. Lockton removed one of the books, and the map curled up on itself, clearing the desk for the plate of Gloucester cheese, and rye bread and the bowl of strawberries I set there. "My most sincere apologies for the interruption," Lockton said. He took a glass of wine from me. "Pray, sir, continue." Gold Buttons took a hasty bite of cheese before speaking. "It has proved more difficult to bribe the patriots to change sides than we anticipated. Those who are fed up with the situation prefer to melt out of the city and walk home to Massachusetts or North Carolina." I removed the serving tray and retreated to my corner. The horses in the painting still leapt the fence. I fought the temptation to reach for the adventures of Mr. Crusoe on the shelf. Instead, I centered my eyes on my feet and my thoughts upon a slice of eel pie. "They turned down the offer of hundreds of acres," Lockton said. "The land offered by the king is distant from their farms." Goldbuttons buttered a piece of bread. "My fellow reports they simply want peace and the chance to get in a good crop of wheat." "Idiots," said Lockton. "The news from Philadelphia is that Congress is close to declaring independence," Goldbuttons continued. I fought the urge to yawn. The master and his friends could complain about the Continental Congress at such length, I feared my ears might drop off. Lockton plucked a strawberry from the bowl and pulled the leaves from it. "And Admiral Howe continues to delay the invasion. It's maddening. The Crown must smash this rebellion into dust so we can return to our former lives with a sense of order." "And higher profits," Goldbuttons added. "If Madam only knew how dull these gatherings were, she would not have been so anxious to barge her way in. I would have happily chopped off the heads of a barrel full of eels to escape another afternoon trapped with men whose voices droned on and on and on like rumbling, dusty grindstones." The mayor set his goblet on the desk. "The time for bribery and persuasion is past. This is the hour when we must unsheath our swords." "Swords?" Lockton shook his head. "We've been over this, David. Our task is to hold this city loyal, nothing more." The mayor leaned back in his chair. "Holding is not enough. They're coming after us, raiding our homes for lead and our stores for anything they desire." Goldbuttons wiped the cheese from his fingers with a handkerchief. "I agree with Elihu. A loyal New York cuts off New England from the other colonies. The rebellion will wither like a vine cut off at the roots." "Cut off a vine and it will grow back," the mayor said. "You must pull it out of the ground and burn it to ensure it is dead." Lockton put the strawberry leaves in the bowl. "Is there a plan afoot to destroy them?" "Most definitely." The mayor's voice was quiet but steely. This was not idle prattle about Congress. I stood still as possible. The mayor scratched at the mustard stain on his cuff. "General Howe delayed the invasion hoping the revolutionary fervor would die down. On the contrary, independent sentiment now burns as far away as Georgia, as well as the western frontier." I am a bookcase, I thought. I am a piece of furniture, not a girl who will remember every word spoken in this room. "The cry for liberty has proved powerful," Lockton said. "The beast has grown too large," the mayor said. "If it breaks free of its chains, we are all in danger. We need to cut off its head." Goldbuttons frowned. "How so?" "We must kill their commander." Lockton drew in his breath sharply. "With Washington gone, the revolution will collapse," predicted the mayor. "War will be averted and countless lives saved. Our world will return to the former state of tranquility we enjoyed before all this nonsense." The study fell so silent, I feared the men would hear my heart beating. "Kill General Washington?" "No," Lockton said, shaking his head. "Not possible. He is a gentleman. Capture him, arrest him, yes, but we dare not harm him." The mayor ticked off the reasons on his fingers. "All of the American leaders have committed treason against the king. You cannot deny that. Treason is the highest offense under English law, worse than murder. And what is the punishment for treason, my friends?" Neither Lockton nor Goldbuttons answered. "To be hung by the neck until dead, then have your body chopped into 4 pieces which are sent to the 4 corners of the kingdom," the mayor continued. "Others propose we send sections of Washington's corpse to Charleston, Philadelphia, and Boston. They want to keep the 4th bit here to be displayed in front of City Hall." The room fell silent again. I could hear the ticking of the hall clock through the wall. Lockton shook his head again. "You cannot guarantee Parliament would rule treason. It's too dangerous. If we dispose of Washington, Parliament will do whatever we ask." "But how can you accomplish this?" asked Goldbuttons. "The man is surrounded by an entire army." "We have a man in the Life Guards committed to our plan. He spends his days within 2 arms' length of the general. On our signal he will act." "And this is why you need the money?" Lockton said. There was the sound of a lid being removed and the jangling of keys. Lockton took a key ring out of the blue china snuff jar on the corner of the desk. He unlocked the top drawer and removed a tall stack of currency, enough to buy a village or 2. I let my eyelids droop as if I was a-dozin'. "The risks are too high," Goldbutton said in a shaky voice. "If we are discovered, we are dead men." "Think not upon the risks, but the reward," suggested the mayor. I peeked. Lockton tugged at his collar to loosen it. "Suspicion will fall on my neck first, David. I require assurance that my role will not be betrayed." "You have my word on it," the mayor said. "Your promise is not enough, sir." Lockton pushed a sheet of paper, a quill, and the inkstand across the desk to the mayor. "Write down the names of those who know of this plot." "Why?" Goldbuttons asked. "The paper will serve as my insurance should I fall into rebel hands again. It will motivate you and our friends to do everything possible to secure my release." "How?" Goldbuttons was still frowning, but the mayor reached for the quill. "If we do not come to Elihu's aid, he will betray our names to the enemy," the mayor said softly. "He is showing us his weakness." "Planning ahead is my strength," Lockton said. "Do not forget your own name, sir." I closed my eyes again. The quill scratched across the paper. Goldbuttons shifted nervously in his chair. "There," the mayor said. I opened my eyes the tiniest bit. Goldbuttons quickly read the paper. A vast conspiracy indeed. He handed it to Lockton, who read the names and smiled. "We are keeping good company." He handed the money to the mayor and lifted his empty glass. "I believe this calls for a toast, gentlemen." I did not step forward with the wine bottle. Lockton needed to believe I was a sleepy servant, unaware of his plans. "Sal!" he snapped. I drew back my head and acted befuddled. "Wine," Lockton said. I crossed the room and emptied the last of the wine into his glass. Lockton frowned. "Fetch another bottle," he said. "Yes, sir." I curtsied and left the room, pondering how I could pass this news along to Curzon. That was when the blood-curdling screams started in the kitchen. I dropped the bottle and ran. Chapter 17. Sunday, June 23rd, through Friday, June 28th, 1776. Among all the species and degree of slavery that have excited the attention of mankind, there is perhaps none more pitiable than that of the ill-suited wife. She is bound by ties from which nothing but death can release her, and whatever her suffering and her wrongs is compelled by delicacy and a regard for personal reputation to submit to them in silence, and conceal them from observation. Unsigned Colonial Era Letter. What with my busy night as a true spy, code word and all, and the heat in the upper gallery of Trinity Church, I fell sound asleep during the sermon the next morning. I woke when the people around me stood so startled that I popped up from the pew and near toppled over the railing. The next 2 days were long and hot as I awaited word from Colonel Regan. Master Lockton did not notice that his list of co-conspirators was a little hand-worn. He was too busy visiting the mayor at his home in Flatbush and spending hours at his warehouse reviewing his accounts. Madam took her meals upstairs. Only Becky was allowed to serve her because of Madam's fear of the demon she claimed inhabited Ruth. Becky said Madam sat sighing by the window and shuffling a deck of playing cards over and over. We did not bother keeping Ruth away from the milk, of course. Instead, we kept one ear open for the thud of Madam's feet on the stairs. When she approached the kitchen, one of us would whisk Ruth down to the cellar. Ruth understood none of this. She did not complain about the egg-sized lump on her head or anything else. After we finished our business in the privy each morning, I took her to check our mystery garden. The green shoots were 2 hands tall, but gave no clue about their identity. It was perfect growing weather, especially for flowers and corn and strawberries. It was perfect weather for going home. I practiced the code over and over until it felt like a prayer in my mouth. Ad astra, ad astra, ad astra. I was desperate to talk to Colonel Regan about our release from the city, but dared not leave Ruth alone in the house with Madam Lockton. The thought of Madam putting Ruth up to auction was a constant torment, like bees darting in and out of my sight, daring me to swat at them. The gossip from the market was fantastical. Becky brought back tales of sea monsters chasing the British fleet and a 2-headed calf born outside Philadelphia that portended all manner of disaster. Folks were prickly and fearful. Loyalist shopkeepers had been tarred and feathered by angry mobs, and their shops destroyed. Each day dawned hotter than the one before. Ad astra, ad astra, ad astra. 2 mornings after my meeting with the colonel, a visitor pounded at the kitchen door. I was kneeling on the other side of it, polishing the lock with an oily rag and rottenstone. The noise near gave me apoplexy. When I opened the door, I was shocked to see not a messenger, but the rotund figure of Mr. Goldbuttons. Instead of wearing a hat or coat, he had a long cloak draped over his head, and his wig sat askew. He stormed past me toward the stairs. "Is your master still abed?" he shouted back at me. "Yes, sir." Goldbuttons dropped his cloak on the floor and ran up the stairs as if his breeches were on fire. A moment later Master Lockton bellowed like a stuck bull, then thudded heavily across the floor and yelled for Becky. The plot to kill Washington had been uncovered. I was sent to fetch Madam home, for she had gone to call on a friend. Goldbuttons had vanished by the time we returned. Madam hurried to the library and told me to fetch her ivory fan from her bedchamber, for she was feeling faint from heat and excitement. As she opened the door, I caught a glimpse of the master pacing frantically, his nightcap still on his head. He looked up and saw us. "Thank heavens! There is much to do and no time. The worst has happened, Anne." I started up the stairs to fetch the fan, moving slow as possible to overhear their words. "What is the meaning of this, Elihu?" Madam demanded. "Listen carefully," Lockton interrupted. "The rebels know. I've sent for a cart. We must burn my papers." "Dear God, protect us," Madam prayed. "How much do they know?" "Wait 1 moment." I took the steps 2 at a time and was near the top when Madam stepped into the hall and pointed at me. "Forget the fan, girl. We need firewood for the library," she said sternly. "Now." Lockton and Madam were exchanging heated words across his desk by the time I brought in an armload of wood and a few coals from the kitchen in the copper coal carrier. They seemed not to notice as I walked in. "You are abandoning me?" Madam asked. "You'll be safer here." Lockton dumped a folio of papers on his desk and rooted through the mess. "Aunt Seymour isn't leaving, and we have credit with all the merchants." "Your aunt despises me," Madam said. "You must stay to defend our name and honor." I arranged the wood so that it would not catch quickly, set the hot coals underneath it, leaned forward, and blew gently. "I am guilty, Anne. They won't give me a parole this time. But as soon as the rebels are driven out, I shall return." "What if they arrest me?" Madam asked. "Let me go with you." "You must stay to keep them from stealing all that we own." Madam picked the blue china snuff jar off the desk and flung it against the wall. It shattered and left a mark on the plaster. "I will not," she shouted. "I will not be left at the mercy of our enemies while you slink away." Despite my best intentions, the kindling wood caught hold of a spark and burst into flame. Master Lockton crossed the room to pick up the keys that had been hidden in the jar. He placed them in his pocket. Then, without warning, hit Madam with all the force in his arm. She flew into the bookcase, causing several books to tumble to the ground. I almost reached for her, but was afraid to anger Lockton any further. "I command you to stay here, Anne. This is your duty, and you will obey me." He turned to me. "The fire is satisfactory. Leave us." "Yes, sir." As I closed the door, Madam started in again, begging him to take her with him, or at least to let her know where he was going. A carpenter soon arrived and nailed the master into a large crate marked "Cheese." As the final boards were being put into place, Lockton told Madame that he would first head north, then to Dr. Van Buskirk's house in Bergen County. 3 men loaded the heavy crate onto a cart driven by a man I had never seen before. Becky tended to Madam's battle wounds with ointment and medicinal wine. I offered to fetch Lady Seymour, but in truth I planned to run the news of Lockton's escape to the rebels as fast as I could. Madam insisted we all stay in the house with the doors and windows locked. She passed the night burning packets of papers in the fire and demanding gallons of tea and fresh biscuits. When the soldiers arrived at dawn to arrest the master, his business papers were all ash, and the crate of cheese was long gone. The angry soldiers tore through the library, but found nothing, save for the shards of the snuff jar. These they stomped under their boots before they departed. Becky went to market and left me to clean the mess. She returned with a freshly killed hen and a basket full of beet greens. Before Becky could remove her bonnet, Madam shuffled into the kitchen. "What news?" Madam demanded. Her red eyes perched above dark rings from a sleepless night. A livid purple welt had raised on the left side of her face where Lockton had struck her. Most of the bruises on her arms and shoulders were hid under her gown, but she walked stiff and sore as an old crone. Becky gave her the gossip from the market stalls. Conspirators who plotted against the American cause had been arrested all over the city and in several close-by villages. The mayor, 2 doctors, a shoemaker, a tailor, a chandler, a gunsmith, a drummer, and a fifer were all charged with treason and a host of other offenses. "How did they uncover the plot?" Madame asked. I picked up the beheaded chicken and carried it to a basin. I held it by the feet so the last of the blood could drain out before I plucked it. Becky hung her hat on its hook and pinned on her apron. One of the conspirators flapped his mouth and the story poured out. Hickey, his name is, a tall Irishman who served in General Washington's Life Guards. Did anyone mention Master Lockton? Only that he was one of them that got away, ma'am. They caught one feller trying to cross the East River. Couldn't row hard enough against the tide. The master is well out of harm's way. Which is more than I can say about myself, Madame muttered, gingerly rubbing the violet bruises on her wrist. Chapter 20. Tuesday, July 2nd through Tuesday, July 9th, 1776. The Congress have judged it necessary to dissolve the connection between Great Britain and the American colonies, and to declare them free and independent states, as you will perceive by the enclosed declaration. I am directed to request you have it proclaimed at the head of the army in the way you shall think most proper. Letter from John Hancock, President of the Continental Congress, to General George Washington. That week unspooled slowly, with hot days and muggy, breathless nights. Militia units from the surrounding colonies piled into the city. Ordinary folks skedaddled out of it as fast as their horse or feet would carry them. The extra soldiers were not the cleanest sort, or maybe they were too busy drilling and making gunpowder cartridges to wash. Whatever the cause, New York soon smelled like a garbage pit mixed with a fresh mountain of manure. The stench cooked under the midsummer sun. Madame's moods changed with the tide. One moment she floated on clouds of fancy, imagining her grand life once the British beat the rebels. Next she fell into melancholy, grumbling about the lazy British commanders floating at anchor off Staten Island, observing New York through long spyglasses, but making no move to invade. She now carried with her a brocade pouch suspended from a red satin cord. Within the pouch lay a green flask filled with a calming elixir prescribed by the doctor. He advised her to drink from it whenever the need arose. She also took to walking around the house in her stocking feet, trying to catch me unawares as I scrubbed or dusted or polished, often with Ruth at my side. She said nothing during these encounters, but watched us with hungry hawk eyes. It unnerved me. The week after Hickey's hanging, Becky suffered a mild attack of the ague that had befallen so many soldiers. She grew pale and sweaty, but did not require purging or leeches. In her stead I went to the market. Our needs were fewer now that we no longer fed the master and his companions. 'Twas a good thing, for farmers were freer to come into the city, and there was less to choose from. More people fled every day, including the wives of General Washington and Colonel Knox and Brigadier Greene. Her that folks said was such a big flirt. I searched for Curzon every day, but Bellingham's affairs kept him out of sight. I was afraid to seek out Colonel Regan, afraid that word would get back to Madame, and our lives to be put in jeopardy. 10 days after the British flooded the river with their ships, news that the Congress had declared independence arrived in New York. The declaration was read to the troops from the steps of City Hall. The men cheered so loud it seemed to shake the whole island. I hurried from the egg cellar to see the cause of the commotion. The cheering men danced and marched down Broadway, tossing their hats into the air and shouting across the river at the silent ships of England. They gathered into a mob on the Bowling Green around the massive statue of King George III. I stayed at the edge of the crowd, hoping for the glimpse of Curzon, or a soldier familiar from my visit to the Battery. The king was mounted on his horse, and the horse mounted on a white marble pedestal that rose to the height of 3 men standing, one atop the other. Both the horse and the man were fashioned larger than could be possible, but I suppose that was the way of kings. They were both made of gold that sometimes glittered in the sunlight, but dulled when the clouds interfered. Ropes appeared as if conjured, thick ropes used for tying ships to the docks. The men cheered louder and worked together to throw the ropes over the king and his horse and tie them tightly. 1, 2, 3, heave! 1, 2, 3, heave! The men strained their arms and backs. Boys on the edge of the crowd jumped up and down. Common folk stood froze at the sight of a king being pulled down by the strength of the men working together. 1, 2, 3, heave! The statue toppled, slowly at first, then gaining speed as the weight fell from the sky to the ground. The men scrambled out the way, no one wishing to be crushed by a falling king. As it crashed, they shouted even louder and swarmed over the thing. Axes were called for and rushed out of workshops and up from the barracks. A half-dozen men took to chopping the king and his steed to bits. I inched closer. How could they be chopping through a statue with simple axes? A piece of tail broke off, and a soldier held it up for all to see. The king was not made of gold, but of soft lead covered with gilt paint. The crowd shouted again as another soldier lifted the king's head freshly removed from his neck. A fife and drum corps started playing just beyond the mob, piping out the song usually heard during a tar and feathering party. The men made short work of King George. When the statue was reduced into pieces that could be easily carted off, they did just that. The plan was to melt down all the lead into bullets. "We'll fire Majesty at the redcoats," joked a man with a booming voice. "Aye," said his companion, shouldering an axe. "Emanations from leaden George will make deep impressions on the enemy." As the crowd marched off to make bullets and celebrate liberty and independence in the taverns, I realized dark was fast falling and I had tarried overly long. I picked up a sliver of lead that lay in the street. It was fringed with gilt, my own piece of Majesty. Tyrants beware, I thought as I put it in my pocket. I was surprised to see the front parlor windows alight when I walked down Wall Street. "Is the master back?" I asked Becky. She was dozing in the chair by the kitchen fire with a red-checked shawl around her shoulders, still worn down from her illness. Becky yawned and stretched. "Far from it. Madam paid a call on the Reverend's wife after supper. Came home with high color in her cheeks and a bee in her bonnet. 'Dress the child,' she says. 'Make sure both of the girls eat something nourishing and sweet.'" "Did she fall and hit her head?" I asked, setting down the basket of eggs. Becky laughed. "I think the Mrs. Reverend served her a dose of Scripture, the hard kind. Madam says, 'I've been too harsh on my servants. I must mend my ways, or the Lord will punish me.'" I was confuddled. She's being kind to Ruth again? Becky stood slowly, wincing from the aches in her bones. "Surely so." Ruth lit up like a lantern when she saw them fancy clothes again. Promised to be quiet as ever. Made short work of the gingerbread Madam baked, too. This was too much. I sat down at the table. "Madam baked?" "She's a fair hand in the kitchen when she puts her mind to it. Left the dishes for yours truly, but the cake was tasty. Those 2 pieces are for you." She was most firm about it. She stopped to cough up what sounded like a large wet worm from her throat. "She cooked up sweet milk for you, too, with nutmeg, cinnamon, and sugar. Said you was to have some with your gingerbread." I sniffed the pitcher. It smelled good enough. "Did you have any?" "Not with this cough. Milk would stop up my lungs." I looked around the kitchen. "Where's Ruth now?" Becky unpinned her apron and folded it, then tied on her bonnet, preparing to go home. "Madam got it in her head to play cards this eve. Has 2 companions in with her, the Mrs. Drinkwater and her daughter, the one who's to marry some sort of lord or duke or some such. Ruth is in with them. She was right cheered after the cake and milk." "Should I take anything in?" "I just come from there. Madam was most definite. Tell Sal to enjoy her cake and a night off. She has worked hard these weeks and could do with a good night's sleep." "She called me Sal instead of girl?" I asked. "And you are full certain she didn't hit her head today?" Becky laughed, and the laugh caught in her throat and bubbled into a cough. "Look here, she's likely to turn back into a sour old cow by breakfast, so I say have a good sit-down and enjoy a little peace." I poured a mug of the milk. Huzzah for the Reverend's wife! I wanted to savor the gingerbread bite by bite and sip the milk slowly, but I couldn't help myself. The mug was drained and the plate empty soon after Becky left. The milk was the sweetest thing I had ever tasted, the spices so thick I could near chew them. No wonder Ruth was cheered by it. I washed up my dishes, tidied the kitchen, and found myself with idle hands. A rare event, indeed. I could sneak into the library and borrow that Crusoe book. I could read by the fire with a mending basket near by to slip the book into should Madame approach. That seemed a fine plan, but first I wanted to shed my bodice. It pinched something awful under my arms. I felt my way down the cellar stairs with my toes and heard the sound of laughter from Madame's company. I yawned. When would they leave? And what sort of ladies came to call this late? I removed my bodice and hung it on a nail. The pallet looked soothing and cool, and the thought of climbing the stairs again made me weary. But I would like to read a few more pages. But I was overly fatigued. But Mr. Crusoe was facing all sorts of dangers. But in betwixt one thought and the next, I fell asleep. For that I shall never forgive myself.